She was clearly a woman, yet she disguised herself as a man for 20 years, not for anything else, but just to survive in that cruel world. Albert worked as a waiter in a high-end hotel for these 20 years. She was like a precisely operating machine, never tiring of repeating the same tasks. She was steady and considerate, so customers praised her frequently, and the madam trusted her completely. But no one knew the secret hidden behind Albert. Albert had no friends. She always came and went alone, avoiding all colleague activities. Every day after work, she would return to her tiny room. The first thing she did was carefully count the tips she received that day. She treasured every coin as if it were a gem, for these savings carried all her hopes for the future. After counting the money, she would carefully hide it under the floorboards of her room, then fall asleep while looking at her mother's photo. In the photo, her mother smiled gently and lovingly. That was the only warm memory she had left in this cold world. She often fantasized that once she saved enough money, she would leave this place and open her own tobacco shop. She longed to live a peaceful and free life there, away from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. However, the gears of fate began to turn inadvertently. On this day, a painter named Hubert came to the restaurant. Due to work needs, Hubert had to spend the night there. The stingy madam, to save money, arranged for Hubert to sleep in Albert's room. This made Albert extremely nervous. She tried to refuse with various excuses, but under the madam's tough attitude, she could only helplessly concede. That night, Albert deliberately lingered outside for a long time. Only when she was sure Hubert was fast asleep did she carefully return to the room. She tiptoed to the place where she hid the money, checked carefully, and found no signs of it being tampered with. Only then did she relax slightly. Then she took off her coat and lay as gently as possible on the edge of the bed. But at that moment, a flea bit her wildly, making her unbearably itchy. She instinctively reached out to scratch, but accidentally made a loud noise, then fell to the ground with a bang. However, the itching was so intense that she couldn't care anymore. She hurriedly unbuttoned her pants and corset, completely unaware that Hubert had been awakened. The secret of her disguising as a man was thus exposed defenselessly. Albert froze on the spot, her mind blank, and fear overwhelmed her like a tide. She knelt down with a thud, her voice trembling as she begged Hubert not to tell anyone about this. Hubert looked at the panic-stricken Albert, feeling mixed emotions, and finally agreed to keep her secret. Even with Hubert's promise, Albert still felt uneasy. The next day, she found various excuses to stick by Hubert's side, confirming over and over whether Hubert would truly keep her secret. Just as Albert was feeling uneasy, Hubert made an unexpected move. She turned around to close the door, then unbuttoned her clothes, revealing the truth hidden beneath. Albert was so frightened that she instinctively took a few steps back. Then Hubert revealed her own secret. It turned out that she had once been an ordinary woman. She married a painter, thinking marriage would be the beginning of a happy life. But it was the start of a nightmare. Her husband was an alcoholic who beat her every time he got drunk. After enduring countless nights of abuse, one day she could no longer bear it. She secretly took her husband's clothes and tools, fled that terrifying home, and began living as a male painter while disguising as a man. What shocked Albert even more was that Hubert later got married again, and her partner was a woman. Hubert told Albert that she understood Albert's situation because they were both people driven to desperation by life, so she would definitely keep Albert's secret. As Albert listened to Hubert's story, her heart was filled with complex emotions. She didn't feel much sympathy for Hubert's tragic experience. Instead, she was more confused and curious. She couldn't understand how people like them, living in the gap between man and woman, could possibly get married. In her perception, she was destined to die alone. Hubert's appearance caused ripples in Albert's life, which had been as calm as stagnant water. She began to realize that there might be other possibilities for her future. Hubert quickly finished her work at the hotel and left. But Hubert's departure didn't bring Albert's life back to peace. Instead, it planted a seed of hope in her heart. Albert started to have new visions for the future. She longed to have a partner like Hubert and live a different life. Albert came to a storefront she had long admired, imagining writing her name on the sign. Inside, there would be 2 counters, one for tobacco and the other for dried fruits. Behind the door would be a drawing room exclusive to her wife, and she fantasized about the good life to come. But Albert still felt confused about all these visions. She decided to visit Hubert and experience her life. Arriving at Hubert's home, she was warmly received by Hubert and her wife, Kathleen. The two, who both disguised as men, chatted happily, and Hubert was also interested in why Albert dressed as a fake man. So Albert for the first time opened her heart to someone. It turned out that she was the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy family. After her birth, Her mother gave her to a foster mother to raise. Later, her biological mother passed away, and the financial support stopped. She and her foster mother were forced to move to the slums. When she was 15, her foster mother also died. Soon after, 5 beasts took advantage of her and violated her. Helpless, she could only silently endure it all. By chance, she learned that the current hotel was hiring. Eager to leave that heartbreaking place, she got a second-hand suit and went to the interview disguised as a man. She was successfully hired, and she had been working there for 20 years. The disguise had become her instinct. Albert and Hubert talked endlessly. In these 20 years, she had never had such a thorough opportunity to vent. She regarded Hubert as a confidant and even told her about her plan to open a tobacco shop and her desire to find a wife to spend her life with. Just like Hubert, Hubert highly approved of Albert's idea and told her that Helen, a girl from her colleagues, was a good choice. She had golden curly hair and a cute little face. If she really wanted to start a new life, she should boldly pursue happiness. On the way home, Albert began to dream of the good life in the future. She even fantasized about the scene of running the shop with Helen, a picture so beautiful that she was lost in it. So the next day, Albert invited Helen on a date, but she didn't know that Helen had already fallen for Joe, the hotel boiler worker, and Joe was a hypocrite who only coveted Helen's body. When Joe learned that Albert was going on a date with Helen, he wasn't angry. Instead, he told Helen to get along with Albert and asked Albert to buy some things. On the first date, Helen unceremoniously asked Albert to buy 2 boxes of high-end chocolates, one of which was for Joe. This made Albert, who was always thrifty, feel heartbroken. Every penny spent felt like cutting her flesh, but for the sake of the beautiful future in her heart, she comforted herself that as long as she could get engaged to Helen, the income from the shop after marriage would make life better, and these expenses were only temporary. On the second date, under Joe's instigation, Helen asked Albert to buy high-end whiskey. Not only that, but Albert also took the initiative to buy Helen the hat she had her eye on, then eagerly took Helen to the shop of her dreams. At the door, Albert excitedly described their future life blueprint. She talked endlessly, her eyes shining, as if those beautiful futures were just around the corner. But as Helen listened, her face became increasingly ugly. For Helen, everything she did was to leave this town and see the outside world. But Albert wanted her to spend her life in this town, which she couldn't accept. In a fit of anger, she turned and left. Helen returned to Joe, who, upon seeing the whiskey, didn't care about Helen's anger but happily began to drink. He shamelessly told Helen to use her body to speed up the process with Albert and drain every penny from her. But this time, Helen refused Joe's request. Her heart seemed to change at that moment. On the other side, Albert was completely unaware of all this. She was still torn about whether to confess her identity to Helen before or after marriage. She was afraid of losing Helen but didn't want to keep hiding. Torn between the two, just then, a fierce flu swept through, and many people fell ill, including Albert. Tormented by the illness, she could only lie in bed struggling. Fortunately, she pulled through. When she finally could go out, she heard a shocking piece of news. Many people in the town had died from the flu, and she immediately worried about her only friend, Hubert. She went to Hubert's home again, only to find that Hubert's lover, Kathleen, had died from the flu. Hubert was immersed in the pain of losing her lover. Looking haggard, looking at Hubert's appearance, Albert suddenly had an idea. Maybe she and Hubert could open a shop together and live, supporting each other. Albert, who had no romantic experience, didn't know what love was. She just needed simple companionship. Hubert quickly realized that Albert had misunderstood her relationship with Kathleen. She took Albert into the room and took out 2 dresses Kathleen had made before her death. They hadn't had a chance to wear them yet. Hubert told Albert that her relationship with Kathleen wasn't just about living together. They were each other's everything, deeply in love. Albert had never experienced such a relationship, so she couldn't understand how deep their love was. To let Albert feel what it was like to be a woman, Hubert decided to go out wearing dresses with Albert. Putting on a dress again, Albert seemed to recover the self she had buried deep in her heart. She ran wildly on the beach, shouting loudly, wanting to release all the pain and grievances she had suppressed over the years. At that moment, she temporarily forgot the troubles and pressures of life and enjoyed this rare freedom and happiness. However, this happiness was so short-lived. Albert eventually fell onto the beach of reality. Looking at the dress on her body, she felt mixed emotions. She realized that although she longed to live like a woman, reality didn't allow her to linger between male and female identities for too long. She had lost her way and didn't know where to go. When they returned home, Hubert looked at the confused Albert and pointed out the direction of life for her. Albert listened to Hubert's words, deep in thought, and a trace of determination showed in her eyes. She decided to propose to Helen. However, reality dealt Albert a harsh blow. When she returned to the hotel dejectedly, she heard the quarrel between Helen and Joe. It turned out that Helen was pregnant with Joe's child, but the scoundrel Joe didn't want to take responsibility, so the two began an endless quarrel. However, the next day, Albert still put on a decent suit and decided to propose to Helen. She knew she loved Helen. She didn't care whose child Helen was carrying. She just wanted to start a life with Helen. She asked Helen out alone and mustered the courage to propose. She told Helen that she had already paid the deposit for the shop and hoped Helen would live a happy life with her and the child. But Helen only cared about the present. She thought Albert had no desire for her and didn't love her at all. In her opinion, if a man didn't even touch his beloved woman, it couldn't be called love. To prove her sincerity, Albert reluctantly gave Helen a kiss, but Helen returned the kiss. Helen bluntly told Albert that she had found a man who loved her, Joe, the father of the child. After saying that, she left without looking back. Albert returned to her room feeling lost. She slowly took off her gloves, and tears couldn't help but flow down. This was the first time she had given for love, only to be left bruised and battered. She didn't know if she should give up. At the same time, Joe came to Helen's room again. He proposed that Helen have an abortion, not wanting the child to affect his future. The two quarreled again. Hearing the quarrel, Albert didn't hesitate to go to Helen's room and knock on the door. Joe, who was in the room, heard Albert's words and rushed out angrily, questioning Albert sentence by sentence about what she was up to. He forcefully pushed Albert back, afraid that the two would fight. Helen quickly stepped in to mediate, but Joe felt that Helen wasn't on his side. In a fit of anger, he roughly pulled Helen into the room. At this moment, Albert felt dizzy. She slowly got up. Everyone was busy pulling them apart, and no one noticed the injured Albert. She silently returned to her room. The physical pain and inner hurt left her without the strength to lock the door. She collapsed on the bed, and blood flowed from her ear. As Helen said goodbye, the quarrel outside finally quieted down. Albert seemed to see the warm and comfortable future she had envisioned, but now it had all come to nothing. Her eyes gradually dimmed, with a trace of relief and helplessness. She closed her eyes and fell asleep forever. After Albert's death, the madam embezzled all her savings and used the money to hire Hubert to repaint the hotel. When Joe learned of Albert's death, he ran away immediately, leaving Helen and the child to fend for themselves. To commemorate the infatuated person she had failed, Helen named the child Albert. Hubert looked at Helen and the child. Feeling mixed emotions, Hubert came to Albert's room. Everything had changed, as if Albert had never been in this world. The only thing left was a photo of Albert's mother. Albert's life was full of tragic colors. She carefully closed herself off, struggling to disguise as a man for more than 20 years. Yet deep down, she always identified as a woman. In that era full of discrimination and oppression against women, she couldn't freely choose her gender or love, and finally left this world alone. She was like a tiny speck of dust, blown around in the tempest of society until she vanished without a trace. The only thing left is a story that makes people sigh. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.